Hey everybody, Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 141st episode of the Writ Podcast. We're now deep into the second week of this election campaign, and it looks like it's Mark Carney's to lose. But how solid are people's opinions at this stage? What do the Liberals need to do to hold on to this lead? And what do the other parties need to do to close the gap? Pollster Panel is back to break it all down. Dan Arnold is Chief Strategy Officer at Pollara and was the Liberals poll surge in the last three federal election campaigns. Andrew Enns is Executive Vice President at Léger. He conducted polling for Stephen Harper's Conservatives. And James Valcke is Director of Research and Strategy at Viewpoints Research and has worked on many central NDP campaigns. Hey everybody, how you doing?
Hey.
Good to be here. Good to be on the podcast, Eric.
How are you guys all holding up in the midst of this election campaign? All right.
I love elections. I don't know about anybody else. They are a unique beast unto any other work we do, and there's a pace of them that it breeds energy.
I'm enjoying it, but I wouldn't mind if like the rest of 2025 is a little bit more relaxing than the last 3 months have been.
What's the second week of a campaign like? Is there like this, there must be the rush of energy at the first week, and then the second week it must be like, okay, we still got like 3 weeks before we actually get to the interesting part again. It must be a bit of a drag.
You're either, if you're winning, you're just upset because you want to get to the end quickly and count the votes. And if you're losing, you start to panic because there's not enough days left to move the votes. So usually not a great mood on any campaign.
We've definitely heard of some panicking in some camps, so we'll get to that in a minute. But first, because this is the first time we've chatted since the writ drop, I would like to get a read from all three of you just how you feel public opinion has really shifted since the beginning of the campaign, kind of the dynamics that are out at play. Andrew, why don't you kick us off? What's striking you from where things have moved or not moved in the last week and a half?
Well, I think from the broad public opinion, I don't think there's been a whole lot of movement sort of since the campaign. I mean, that liberal rise, we saw that going, almost from the get-go when Prime Minister Trudeau announced his resignation and then Trump weighed in, and we saw a pretty steady trajectory. That's in our polling, anyways. We've seen that sort of plateau out. There's certainly been still a bit of movement in some regions. I think in Quebec, in particular, there's been some movement, positive movement for the Liberals, and not so good movement for the Bloc Québécois. For sure, and it's made things interesting there. But yeah, I think it's been interesting because as the campaign week has gone on, I think attentions, obviously the leaders are getting their fair share, but there's also been this ramp up of, it's, what are they calling it, Liberation Days coming, and so that's always been sort of as a bit of a backstop. And I don't know if voters are locking in with opinions or holding their breath to see what this week will hold, or maybe they're just sort of sitting back and watching.
Yeah, I should point out we're recording this at about noon on Wednesday, so by the time people might be listening or watching to this, we might know what's going to come out of the tariffs and all that kind of stuff. But so clearly we're talking about pre-tariff tariff news. James, what do you think? What has really struck you from this first week?
Yeah, to jump off of Andrew's point, I'm tracking a lot of I'm looking at sentiment and like people's responses, and I would say Andrew pretty much nailed it. Like there is a anticipation, like to be perfectly honest, the Trump thing has become the defining issue. Trump tariffs, it is the elephant in the room, and Canadians are from what I'm seeing, they're getting ready. They're flinching, right? Like they're recoiling at what's happening. They're kind of anticipating what's the next thing to happen. And I think that is going to, it has usurped the Conservatives' narrative. That's very true. The Liberals are leaning as heavily as possible into it. I'm sure Mark Carney, the candidate for the Liberal Party, is okay with taking a break to put on his hat as Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada, to take care of some of the business of the country. I'm sure that is a burden he wears lightly. But it has also defined people's sentiment towards the leaders. I think that there is a contrast that is pretty hard right now between Carney and Poilievre. Poilievre is over-caffeinated, overly aggressive, and Carney, in contrast to that, is quite calm. As far as like the New Dems are concerned, I think they're trying to elbow their way into some of those narratives and those stories and staying on message, and I think they're hitting a lot of the right places. But that Trump narrative has stuck, even though there's still lots of time in this campaign, right? Like, we are over 3 weeks to go. There's a lot of that narrative still to burn. And you know, as I said with Conservatives in 2024, peaking at your highest level, you don't want to peak too early. And right now, because elections are microcosms of a calendar, you don't want to peak too early in an election campaign either. And there may be concern that momentum could fall out, the wind could fall out of the sails of the liberal boat, and there may be space for those other parties to regain some of that ground.
So here I was thinking you were talking about the NDP peaking a little too early, but
oh, that's the peak. It's not a high peak, but I mean, based on what we've seen so far from the polls, it's not even clear yet if the Liberals have hit that ceiling yet, based on some of the numbers. So we'll have to see if that crest is going to happen at some point. Dan, what strikes you from so far these first week and a half?
Yeah, look, at the very least, I'd say there's no indication that Carney is bleeding anywhere, is taking any lumps. And I mean, he hasn't been lights out on the campaign trail. He's made mistakes, and people have called him out on mistakes. And, you know, he hasn't been, I don't think, setting the world on fire. Poilievre's the one who's got the big rallies and all the excitement on the ground. But yeah, from the polling perspective, like, if anything, Carney's personal numbers have maybe gone up, or at least they haven't gone down despite the attacks, despite the attack ads. And, you know, time starts to tick for the Conservatives in terms of how do you land a blow against this guy and how do you throw him off. And yes, there's still 4 weeks left, but, you know, they aren't showing any indication anyways that they found the vulnerability and how to knock him off his game. And, you know, for that, and I think it's a great result for the Liberals in the first couple of weeks. You know, people were raising a stink about Carney's struggling in Quebec and having trouble there, but like, his Quebec numbers, if anything, keep getting better, right? So there's no real indication that the public is softening on him at this point.
Yeah, there was a poll came out from Léger this morning that had questions in Quebec on whether Quebecers thought he spoke French well or not. You had people who thought he did, like the plurality said he spoke it badly. You had a majority who said that he should reveal more of his personal finances. And you had a plurality not happy he avoided the TVA debate. And the same poll had him at 43%, I think, or 42 or 43% in Quebec. It's like, it doesn't matter. So Andrew, does that mean that what's happening on the campaign doesn't matter?
Well, what it means is, and James is right, what it means right now, and take Quebec, take the rest of the country, I mean, this is about, you know, who's defending the country, who's this leader who's defending the country against this aggressive behavior from President Trump and the U.S. administration. And in Quebec in particular, I mean, you know, the Quebec separatist movement, you know, they viewed Canada not as a threat to their language, their culture, their way of life. They viewed it as a hindrance. They felt that they could do better economically, they could do better culturally if they weren't part of Canada. But it wasn't like there was a threat there. It was more, you know, that it was holding them back. The United States is a legitimate threat. I mean, if Canada becomes a 51st state, guaranteed bilingualism's done. And you know, Quebec is buried in this, and so they, you know, Mr. Blanchet is suddenly figuring out that, you know, his separatist stance is not working at this particular junction. This isn't a you know, it's a seismic shift in the sense of a very, I suspect, a very temporary shift to respond very clearly to a particular action by the U.S. that will not go on forever. But right now, there are lots of people who traditionally would cast their vote for the Bloc Québécois are looking at a Federalist Party, and, you know, the Liberals are the I would suggest, you know, I put this like the least offensive option. I mean, I think no secret Pierre Poilievre has not made great efforts of endearing himself to Quebecers. Maybe in hindsight we'll revisit that. But it's also his stance on natural resource development and energy policy doesn't jive well. And so, the Liberals at this stage are the parking lot for that vote. And but I will say, like, it's not this love for the Liberal Party or this love for Mark Carney. I mean, Dan's right. Mark Carney didn't have a great week in Quebec, and it showed up in our numbers. I mean, when asked which campaign performed well, decidedly lower numbers in Quebec. That vote, we asked a question on the stickiness of the vote, and it's much looser in Quebec. So there's room for change for sure, but until that threat dissipates that's coming from south of the border, I'm not sure it changes. Like to Dan's point, no one so far has figured out the narrative to get in and start to carve in and wedge out a little bit of that to say, look, I'm just as good at defending Canada. I might not be prime minister. I might not be able to get a phone call from Donald Trump, but I still have a plan and a thing. And they haven't got there yet, I think. And that's the challenge that Dan rightly points out.
I just think that the Trump thing has taken over everything. Like, we're doing some tracking for clients at Pollara on the election, on the leadership comparisons. When you ask, like, shares my values, understands people like me, like the questions that usually predict vote, Poilievre and Carney aren't that far apart. But then we got Carney up by about 20 points on things like best to deal with the economic fallout of tariffs, best to deal with Trump. I mean, that is what is supercharging him right now. And it's just, as Andrew said, like, people are just looking past everything else that happens on the campaign trail. Like, who cares that they've got a candidate they were slow dropping when the country's future is at risk here, right? Like, it's just, there's nothing that really seems to be breaking through in the scope of what the big issue is right now.
I'd say who cares for now, but there is time. And as it stands, Carney has pretty much gotten a bit of a free ride when it comes to the National Gallery and some of his background and history. Right now, they've kind of, the narrative has unfolded as it was, but if he continues to maintain this heavy lead in the polls, like we're starting to see it now, Bob Fife has got a story about tax havens under Brookfield and the number of taxes Brookfield has paid in Canadian taxes. And we've seen Carney have a few blind spots in answering some of that stuff. There's kind of a disconnect between the lives of ordinary Canadians and the life that he lived and his response to it. Initially, his instincts are not been good. He's been able to pivot, but as the campaign goes on, if he continues to maintain this lead, there's going to be this the pressure will start. Presumably, the pressure will start going on to scrutinizing. Okay, who is this guy? What does he look like? And what's he going to do as prime minister? Like we've seen his CV. Now let's kick the tires and see what it looks like.
I still have some doubts that, like what Dan says, that any of that other stuff is actually, like, I think people are voting so much on this one issue in a way that is we don't see in a normal campaign. That I think that in a normal campaign, James, I think you're right, these kinds of things would prove to be bigger vulnerabilities. But I'm just wondering if anybody cares about any of this stuff in the midst of what's happening in the United States.
Eric, you prefaced our conversation by we're pre-tariff, pre-tariff announcement. I mean, I do sort of see the potential where, I mean, if the tariffs come and they're not as bad, and then there's a sort of a sense that this is it for the time being. Maybe, to James' point, maybe then other issues can percolate to the top. I think there's also a flip side if the tariffs are bad. I don't know. I won't say worse than expected because I really don't know what we're expecting. But if they're bad, I mean, it could put pressure back on. That those could show up fairly quickly in grocery stores and in certain areas. Which again, I can't predict. I think you're kind of right, Eric and Dan, that it could still then keeps the Trump factor so high, so elevated. But does it bring affordability into the question? And suddenly, then you open up a little opportunity for the other parties to get after that, and you can go after suddenly Prime Minister Carney, who actually has responsibility for these and had the conversation with President Trump. Did he not do a good job in that conversation? Because clearly Canada is still getting hammered. I mean, unfair as that would probably be, because what conversation?
Yeah, and
that guy. But
I'll jump. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's all. I think there is dynamic here. At the moment, it looks pretty hard to see what punches through, but there's potential still for some change, which makes this still kind of interesting.
And I'll say, like, that's kind of the magic of polling and crosstab analysis, right? Like you ask the question early on, who you're going to vote for. Great. You have top line numbers. And then you say, are you certain, or is there a chance you might switch? And once you get those people when they might switch, you pull them off to the side and you say, okay, what do you think? And then you start looking at the analysis of how they responded to different questions, what things they're comfortable with, what they're not comfortable with, the issues that really push them. And you start getting a much different story than that like 30,000 foot central Canada narrative of what's happening. And you start seeing regional differences. You start seeing like cross-pressured voter differences. And in there is where you can build momentum of where you think you're going to grow next. That's the areas of growth you're looking to hit. Or if you're losing people, you look who voted last time and are on the fence this time, and what do they care about? And that helps define some of that narrative moving stuff that you try and insert into paid and regional and shared and earned media that the parties look at. So the top line numbers say one thing, but it's a campaign, and you break out a microscope and you dig down deep and you try to see where there are opportunities. And every party has opportunities right now. I will say that.
One of the things, though, is just it still comes down to making a choice, right? And Carney's numbers are still better than Poilievre's and Singh's. So like those numbers would have to change, because in the end, people still need to feel that the other options would be the better option, right? If you're suddenly not as impressed with Carney, but you still are more unimpressed with the other two, then you stick with Carney, right?
Only potentially, because you see regional differences. Like we saw a little bit in southwestern Ontario in the Ontario election. Yeah, Bonnie Crombie was running second, but that didn't turn into seats in Kitchener-Waterloo or London's or the Windsors, right? So like there are regional environs. Like if you look at Windsor, for example, they have competing television stations. There's almost no friggin' regional media outlets that have competing television statements, but there's a newspaper. Like they have active media with their own conversations that are happening. And while the 30,000 foot narrative means a lot to the CBC National News, what the Windsor Star page 3 says is a different conversation happening, and there is different stuff happening out there in the world. I'll say that.
I don't think that's true. I think everything's the same everywhere. Dan, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about maybe some of the demographic differences we're starting to see and how support is building and developing in the course of this campaign.
Yeah, I find it really interesting. I think the story around what's happening with different age groups is really different from what we've seen in the past campaigns. At the end of the day, like the Liberal map might not look that different than it did in 2015 or 19 or 21, but the demographic changes are quite different from the vote, at least from what I've seen in our polling. So, if you kind of just slice the electorate into four different groups here, men, women, younger, older, among younger women, no surprise there. They don't love the Conservatives. Liberals, big lead there. They've been able to pull over some of the NDP vote that's been there over the past couple of months, but there's still a bit of NDP vote there. Older women has been the Liberal bedrock for, even when things were bad, this was their best demographic, and that's obviously still with them, and that's the group that you really need to hypercharge here. But what's going on with men is really interesting. I've still got Poilievre leading among men under 50. His personal numbers are still very good there. That's a group that seems to be very focused on affordability, and, they seem to be largely on side with Poilievre and the message he's giving. But at least the numbers I've seen, like, the Liberals at least tied, if not leading among men over 50. Carney's personal numbers much better than Poilievre's personal numbers. And that's something, I've looked at a lot of Liberal crosstabs over the last decade, and like never would older men be a group that you would even go to on the crosstabs, because you just assume they're a lost cause. Whereas right now, because of tariffs, because of Carney maybe being a bit of a comforting voice on that issue to that older men and what they're looking for, they're probably a little turned off a bit, I think, from the kind of Trumpiness of Poilievre and his populist leans as well, too. That's a group that seems to be moving towards the Liberals. Obviously not still as much as older women, but if the Liberals can even tie the election among men over 50, that's a real boon for them. It's going to help them when it comes to turnout, and it's probably going to help them in some parts of the country that they even haven't been as competitive in before, too.
Dan, based on like this election versus ones you've looked in the past, do you have any indicators that the vote is more solid, less solid, more volatile, less volatile than in the past? Like, how would you measure that and come to the conclusion of whether there is vulnerabilities for things to move around a lot, and if it is any different from past elections.
I mean, look, when you ask people if they're going to change their mind, I don't see the numbers being that dramatically different from past elections or undecided rates. It is true, as other people have said in their polling, that the Conservative vote is stronger and less likely to change its mind. But that's almost always the case in election campaigns as well, too. But you still have, depending how you ask the question, at least a third, if not more than that, of Liberal voters that are open to changing their minds. So I think there's certainly potential for things to move around. But if the Liberals can keep their support among older voters, when you get to election day, those are the voters that will come out to the advance polls. Those are the voters that will turn out, and I think that could even help them outperform the polls when you get to election day if those numbers hold.
Yeah, a lot of the numbers, with the age breakdowns, you would almost suggest that the Liberals would beat their polls, which you don't normally see, right? So that's kind of a weird development if that's what happens on election day. I want to move on to what's been going on over on the Conservative side of the aisle. There's lots of discussion over whether the Conservatives need to pivot. Lots of anonymous Conservatives, some less anonymous Conservatives coming out and criticizing the approach that the party has taken. Andrew, what do you make of, first of all, those criticisms? And based on what you see in the numbers, are they founded or not?
First of all, not surprised that you've got some of this stuff going on in the media. This was a party that 3 months ago was probably sizing up furniture and stuff like that in terms of things, and so pretty dramatic change of fortune. I think some of the questions and some of the challenges to the campaign and the strategy are founded on good intentions and look, I mean, as we've all said, the environment is different, and so that has to be taken into account. That said, I don't know, like some of the calls to suggest a massive has to be a massive shift. I think Peter White in the Globe and Mail today, suggests Poilievre's got to drop all the populists and become Captain Canada, and that's not going to work. Poilievre is who he is. He spent 2 years working very hard on that. So what he needs to do though is look at the message and look for a way to cleave in. I mean, he was successful tapping into how people felt. Very successful. He was quick to figure out that people were frustrated with what was going on in the country. I mean, lots of people sort of poo-pooed the Canada is broken, but it caught. And it was at a time when crazy things were happening in our country. You couldn't fly, you couldn't travel by air and expect to get your bag at any particular time. You couldn't get a passport. There were a lot of things going on. He got on the inflation message, carved out carbon tax. He was responding to how Canadians felt quite emotionally. They were angry. They were angry at a government, and he was able to get into that. He needs to appreciate that Canadians now still have some very, very strong emotions. So that should be an opportunity for a guy like him. But the emotions have changed, right? It's now a lot of anxiety, fear. There's a bit of patriotism in there. And so I think that's what he needs to sort of, they call it pivot, whatever it is. I think even this morning, there was a speech I think he gave in Toronto where he broadened his message to the economy, the foundations, and talked about that stronger Canada. That's an area where maybe he can start to go. Is that a massive rethink? I don't think it is. I don't think he's going to jettison the affordability. I don't think he's going to jettison his champion of the energy and some of those other areas. I think he can position it and couch it in maybe a broader message of the long-term strengthening of the country. But it's I think it'd be a mistake for him to try to out Carney in terms of being I'm best on Trump. I think if he starts saying, this is what I'd say to President, I don't know whether that would work, because whatever he said, I think Mark Carney would just do. Like, well, I'm going to meet with my war cabinet and talk about the economy. Or, you know what, I'm going to talk to the president of Mexico and we're going to strategize. What do the opposition politicians do? You know, I just don't know whether that's ultimately, if the campaign continues on in the same track, like the same emotion, you know, the inability to get in on that is probably going to mean a Liberal majority. But I think that the opportunity to turn things around is not trying to, you know, try to equal Carney as being one-on-one. I'm better than Carney is on dealing with mano-on-mano with Trump. I think it needs to be you know, it needs to find a slightly different tact and still get into the narrative.
James, what do you think? And also, you know, when I look at the national landscape, the Conservatives could use some more support for the NDP. And I'm wondering if the Conservatives can somehow engineer that in some sort of reverse judo move. But what do you think?
Yeah, I think, you know, Dan talked about demographics, and I would say regional demographics are important. And right now, Poilievre is trailing handily in Ontario, which is a third of the seats, in the Ontario suburbs, which is the GTA, the Tri-Cities, Toronto. Like, as my young kids would say, L's in the chat, they're cooked. They need to turn that around. But on the so I mean, that doesn't answer the question about the impact of the NDP's numbers. But like, if I'm Conservative HQ, I'm looking at regional weaknesses and where we need to focus our money for the next 3 weeks. And the trick they have, the one thing I would strongly disagree with Andrew on is he said Pierre has been learning these lessons over 2 years. Pierre's been learning these lessons over 20 years, 20 plus years. Like when he was president of the Conservative Club in University of Alberta, he's learning lessons from that he's still using today. And that's the problem. He's not been able to change. And it's not a matter of changing. It's like you can't change your stripes. He comes across as authentic when he is this aggressive, pardon my French, asshole, right? And that worked under Trudeau. People wanted a little retribution for the price of healthcare, the price of the rising cost of inflation, groceries. Galen Weston wasn't in the offing, but Trudeau was. And Poilievre was that vessel to express those emotions. That's changed. He can't change. And that's the problem. People see through inauthentic BS. But, and to be perfectly honest, he's got a real problem with women. That's not a surprise. I think everyone knows that. I'm not, you know, telling the truth outside of school. But the one thing the Trudeaus do, that the Conservatives have, is a flotilla of cash. And they need to spend their way through this, whether it's like hammering every single television device, out of office, out of home advertising in those areas that they are weak. They need to get back in the game. And one that includes inserting themselves back into the narrative, but they also, and we're seeing this, they're trying to triangulate a way to bring Carney's numbers down. Because look, when we do focus groups, like on the polling, you say, oh, they've got people have a positive impression of plus 26 and a negative impression of minus 28, minus 18. That tells you nothing. When you get into focus groups, you understand like what people believe and why they think it and what brings them those numbers. I would say Carney's right now are a bit artificial because people don't know him. They're projecting things onto him that they really don't know what he would be like as an elected official. He's never run for office. They have nothing to work on except for his CV. For Poilievre, they know him, they've seen him, they've kicked tires, and they don't like him. And I don't think that's changing overnight.
But just for the record, I mean, Poilievre's 5 points better than he was where the Tories were in 2021. In the last election, like at 39%, that's not a terrible result.
No,
it's only terrible because the NDP are at 8%. That's the problem, right? I mean, 39%, the Conservatives, the NDP are at 20%. That puts them in a pretty healthy spot. But the splits have gone out the window, and it's a two-party race in Canada, and this is uncharted territory for normal elections. And I think that's the challenge that you're trying to push. You know, Tories need 44% in a two-party race to get where they need to electorally in terms of seats.
Yeah.
Maybe the Conservatives can use some of that money for some ads. Be like, our guy's good, but Singh's okay too. You could do him if you want. Dan, what do you think of the strategy so far?
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I think you talk about a pivot. I mean, the problem is I think it's almost Poilievre himself and what he's become. And maybe he just needs to get the glasses back on for the last half of the campaign. And because it seems the problem is like the last 2 years, he's kind of ingrained this personality of his on people. And that's not what they're looking for right now. As others have said, like it was a great antidote to Trudeau when people want to change from Trudeau. And when the ballot question is Trump, it's really rubbing them the wrong way. Like like in disclosure, like I'm not doing any research for the Liberals during the campaign, but I did some focus groups back in January, February for them around kind of Poilievre branding. And you would, show people clips of Poilievre in focus groups. I remember there's one clip where we weren't even trying to test like what they thought of Poilievre, but he's giving an interview and he says something like, that's why everyone's calling him Carbon Tax Carney. And the people in the group are like, oh my God, this sounds just like Trump. Like, it's like you make a nickname for somebody and you say people are saying things like this. And I think the biggest problem that I saw then, that is, I think, still the case right now, is that people feel he sounds like Trump. They feel he uses the same slogans, the same playbook. And that's just repulsive right now. And it's turning people off from what they're looking for. And I think unless he changes his whole kind of demeanor and his whole outlook and his shtick and his negativity and all of that, then I think it's going to be difficult for him to connect with people. And it's hard for somebody who's been doing this for a long time to change that quickly in terms of who he is. It's not just a matter of making different announcements every day. I think it's just the way he's talking, the way he's coming across, the way he's sounding, and it's sounding too Trumpian for people right now. And that's something he's going to have to change.
Just one last thing. I'm just curious. So part of the criticism, I think, that has come from, Corey Snykes of the world was that the Conservatives weren't really understanding how much trouble they're in, that they're behind in the polls, that they're on track to lose, at least based on where it is now. I'd suggest that the NDP might be a little bit in this scenario as well, right? Because these numbers that we're seeing in the polls are some of the worst I've seen in decades, right? And so when you're doing the kind of work that you've done in the past, and if anybody wants to jump in with a story, I'd love it. Telling the news that no one wants to hear, telling so you're the data guys, you're going to the campaign and saying, these numbers are really bad. We need to pay attention to this. How does that go over within a campaign? Like, how do you do that when people don't want to know just how much trouble they're in?
Eric, I'll start. I was on the Central campaign in 2011, and I was on the Central campaign in 2015, and the sentiment from the NDP campaign with regards to polling was different. But I can say this, like, throughout that, there is one adage that sticks. Polls go up, polls go down. Up is better, but that always happens. I'm not sure what other people's experience is, but you don't break out 2-hour brainstorming sessions where everybody whinges about the current state of the race. What you do is you look at what's available. Time is so limited in campaigns. You look at where your space is, where you can grow, what the sentiment is within that growth portfolio, and you drive to that. That's no different if you're way ahead in the polls or if you're falling behind in the polls. There's just not a time to sit, and there's time for beers and unpacking and dissection at E+1, the day after the campaign, and then some. But right now it's all hands on deck. Folks are moving where they need to go, and you try to keep your staff focused on the task at hand, which is electing your MPs in the ridings they need to be elected in. That's the best I got for you on that one.
I mean, I'll say on the 2021 campaign, I do remember we had a senior campaign meeting a week or two into the campaign because the Plain people were in town in Ottawa, so everyone kind of got together at the office. And I mean, I gave a polling update and said pretty bluntly, like, if this trajectory continues, we're going to lose this election. And I think to the credit of the campaign team, nobody panicked. There was still a plan. The plan initially was to back end the advertising buy. Nobody blew that plan up and said, okay, we got to spend all the money next week. It was still like, that's when the ads are going to air. We've got a plan for a trajectory. We're going to stick to that. But I think there was still an acknowledgement that things had to change. And that's kind of in that meeting where we came to the decision that we would be running attack ads against Aaron O'Toole, which is something that the campaign had been a little leery about in the past iterations of Trudeau land going that hard negatively. But again, it was kind of like, okay, but we're going to like test some things to make sure they work first. We're not going to just blow something out tomorrow. So we had some concepts and we tested them. And, you know, you don't want to panic in these situations, but I think you have to acknowledge that there are challenges. And, you know, a good campaign is one that will look at the situation they're in and say, yes, we need to change this, but we don't want to like completely panic and mess up the way to effectively pivot here. But I think, you know, if the campaigns are doing things properly, they will map out a plan and hopefully execute that to respond.
Andrew, you ever had to give some bad news?
Yeah, I mean, you know, probably, I think 3 times throughout that 2015 campaign because it was so freaking long. You know, but so the research is very focused and targeted on certain regions that, you know, you're in 2015 ultimately, you know, the Conservatives were looking to protect and hold on to, and that would you know, sustain the majority. The initial stuff was you know, the early in the campaign, similar to what Dan, you know, the news wasn't great, and it wasn't about a panic, but it was about you know, we had so much time. It's like, okay, what we're saying is not working. So we need to think about, you know, the advertising, the messaging, that sort of thing. As the campaign moves on, it starts to get a little more focused. And I recall sort of post Labor Day, there were some pretty intense meetings where, you know, it was looking clear that there was trouble for sure, and there were differences of opinion, you know, in that campaign, and that's, you know, as Dan said, I mean, it's you know, it can get challenging in terms of how you respond to it. As the pollster, you know, it's numbers. I mean, your job is to make sure the numbers are as tight as they are. You know, we had some qual at the same time. And you know, that's you know, James has said it you know, a lot in these conversations that we've been having together. The qual allows you to talk more definitively about the numbers and provide a bit more, present it in a way that you can get people around the table to understand it a little better. But yeah, it's, you know, they're tough conversations and good campaigns. I tend to say that you know, there's a good, healthy discussion in a meeting in our minds, and an action comes out of that. Less good campaigns, there can be sort of more consternation.
Well, I'm glad to hear that in most cases everyone is very mature in Party HQ and everybody has that sang-froid. We'll see if it's going to hold over the next few weeks, because I think there's going to be some alarms going off at some point for some parties at some point in this campaign. And when it happens, we will chat about it again. So thanks a lot to the 3 of you. I know it's a busy time, so I appreciate taking some time with me. And looking forward to the next time we can chat.
My pleasure, Eric.
All right, as always, Eric.